In the early 2000s, a consensus solidified across the academic and political world. Market liberalization was tearing the global economy apart, driving a wedge between the ultra-rich and the absolute poor. Public intellectuals like Noam Chomsky, alongside leading institutions like the United Nations, declared that global inequality was soaring. The 1999 UN Human Development Report formalized this perspective. They published data tracking a rapidly widening gap between the world's richest and poorest nations. But auditing the specific mathematical techniques used to build that report reveals a deep flaw in the underlying calculations. When international organizations rely on incorrect units of measurement, they produce data that mathematically verifies a crisis that does not exist. The UN built its case on two distinct observations. Domestic inequality was rising within individual nations, and income disparities across different nations were accelerating. To prove that across-country inequality was expanding, they measured the ratio of the per capita income of the richest 20% of the global population to the poorest 20%. This chart shows their exact findings. Look at the steeply rising dashed line labeled HDR ratio. The report stated that the income ratio widened from 30-1 in 1960 to a staggering 74-1 by 1997. The error lies in the baseline currency unit. The UN calculated these global incomes using current, nominal exchange rates rather than adjusting for local purchasing power. Correcting this currency error and auditing the statistical mechanics reveals the opposite trend: a historic decline in both absolute poverty and global income inequality. A citizen's survival depends entirely on the cost of goods and services in their local economy. A metric that evaluates a farmer in Ethiopia based on their theoretical ability to afford a hotel room in Manhattan is mathematically useless. To accurately compare living standards across borders, economists use a metric called purchasing power parity, or PPP. Because labor-intensive, non-traded goods are significantly cheaper in low-productivity countries, international currency markets consistently undervalue the actual domestic purchasing power of poor nations. Returning to the chart, the solid blue line represents data adjusted for purchasing power parity. The massive gap disappears. The true ratio peaked in 1980 at 16-1, then slowly declined through the 1990s. Adjusting for what money can actually buy flattens the UN's explosive growth curve entirely. This chart displays the second major pillar of the divergence narrative, the variance of log GDP per capita across 125 countries. The steadily climbing line demonstrates a steep, undeniable increase in inequality between nations. But this graph relies on a specific statistical distortion. It treats every sovereign nation as a single, equal data point, regardless of how many people actually live there. Under this framework, a 1% increase in the per capita income of Lesotho has the exact same mathematical impact on global inequality as a 1% income growth in China. To measure human inequality accurately, we must shift the unit of analysis away from sovereign borders and apply population weighting to the data. Look at this chart comparing the two methods. The red line charts the variance of log per capita income once population weighting is applied. It breaks away from the unweighted line and plunges sharply downward after 1978. When macroeconomic metrics weigh every human life equally, the supposed trend of mass divergence becomes an undeniable trend of convergence. Even population-weighted averages contain a blind spot. They assume everyone inside a country shares the exact same income, obscuring domestic disparities. Measuring this requires individual income data, but no unified global database exists to track the personal incomes of 5 billion human beings. Researchers solve this by splitting a nation's aggregate GDP into 5 distinct income brackets, using available domestic survey data to estimate the actual distribution. Mapping these quintiles across 125 countries forms a Gaussian kernel density function, a true statistical model of global income. By integrating the specific area falling below the $1 and $2 thresholds on this curve, the exact poverty headcount emerges. Combining aggregate GDP with quintile survey data bypasses the arbitrary borders of sovereign nations to measure the actual distribution of global wealth. The synthesized output of this kernel density data yields a clear result. Global individual income inequality dropped by more than 5% over the final 2 decades of the 20th century. This presents a paradox. Domestic inequality demonstrably rose in almost every major economy during this exact same period. To resolve this, economists use the mean logarithmic deviation. This metric isolates domestic inequality from inequality across nations. While domestic inequality increased slightly, massive gaps between nations dictate 70% of global inequality. The drop in across-country inequality completely dominates. The primary demographic engine driving this convergence was China. Over 1 billion Chinese citizens experienced rapid aggregate GDP growth starting in the late 1970s. Shortly after, 1 billion citizens in India followed a similar trajectory, shifting their average incomes toward the higher levels of the OECD economies. Because these two massive populations started at the extreme bottom of the global poverty distribution, their structural shift toward the global middle mathematically overpowered all domestic inequality increases combined. However, this dataset contains a severe warning. As Asian economies successfully converge with the West, they pull away from the absolute bottom of the income distribution, a phenomenon called the divergence from the poor effect. Excluding China and India, over 80% of the human beings currently in the world's lowest income quintile live on the African continent. If the Asian convergence reaches completion, while the 700 million citizens of Africa remain economically stagnant, global inequality will inevitably reverse course and resume a steep upward trajectory. Global poverty rates are overwhelmingly determined by aggregate national economic growth, not by domestic wealth redistribution. If policymakers are serious about preventing a future rise in global inequality, their singular priority must be the aggregate GDP